Welcome. We'd like to invite you to sit down with us for another evening with Entheo Society. This evening's event is the Jewish Entheogenic Group, kind of just loosely called the Psychedelic Revolution and All Things Jewish. I want to introduce the speakers, and we'll be learning more about them throughout the hour of getting together. But Sammy Witness is one of the speakers, and she'll tell us a little bit about her background. Susanna Eller is another speaker, and then Natalie Ginsburg is our third speaker, though we'll have other people in the audience speaking as well. And I think what we'll do is start off with maybe just an introduction into talking about where people are coming from or what their background is, what they feel like sharing about themselves as far as anything entheogenic, anything Jewish. And we'll begin that in just one moment. I'm going to pause and let folks in who have gathered. Welcome. I think that's everyone who's currently on the call. And then what I'll do is ask everyone to please mute yourselves. Don't do that, please. Okay, so welcome, and we're excited to have an evening of discussing entheogenic culture and being Jewish and the wide variety of perspectives and unique, ways of practicing being Jewish and also being part of the entheogenic community, or just beginning to learn about the entheogenic community. We have people here today that are very experienced in being a leader in the entheogenic community and the psychedelic revolution. And then we have people that are very new in their journey. So I think what we'll do is we'll have each speaker introduce themselves and talk just for a few minutes about themselves and how they identify as Jewish, or if they identify as Jewish, or where they identify as Jewish, and how where they are maybe in their psychedelic journey or their integration into the entheogenic world. And then we'll go into our first question. At the end, we'll have questions from the audience. So please write your questions in the chat and we will ask them at the end. So why don't we start off with you, Susanna, and I'll mute myself. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm Susanna Eller, and I am a psychotherapist, and I practice here in Seattle. And I came from a background of a conservative Jewish upbringing and a child of the 80s where drugs were bad. And I was a product of the educational system of the DARE education system, and, good kids didn't do drugs. And my parents were very clean cut, and I don't think they ever did any drugs in their entire lives. I think my dad got drunk once in his life and had been in the military, and his military friends made fun of him once, the one time that he tried alcohol, and so he never did it again because he was a lousy drunk. And so it wasn't part of our culture in our family. And then I went to Brandeis University, and Judaism was always a part of my life. I grew up in Spokane, Washington, which is a very kind of right-wing conservative community and not a very Jewish community. And so I chose to go to Brandeis because it was a very Jewish community, and I didn't want to have to explain my Judaism to people. And so I wanted to be in a place where that part of me didn't need explanation. But that was a very drug-friendly community. It was a very progressive community. I still was not a very experienced drug person, But I was very into psychology and very into helping people. And really, for me, that was the path that I went on. I became a psychotherapist and worked as a psychotherapist for the last 20 plus years, and have spent most of my career dedicated to elders and chronic illness, actually, and specifically neurology. And in the last few years was recruited by Seattle Neuropsychiatric Treatment Center, where they asked me in the pandemic to learn about psychedelic assisted psychotherapy so that I could better help people who are really suffering. And so I spent the last year training with the really awesome trainings that are happening around the country. And I did 200 hours of training with a program that was mostly virtual, but then some in person in Colorado. And then I have now been doing the virtual MAPS training around MDMA assisted psychotherapy. And I'm getting ready to hopefully finish that up. So I'm now a certified psychedelic assisted psychotherapist, and I do ketamine assisted psychotherapy. And then I'm preparing to hopefully do the in-person part of the MAPS training so that I can do MDMA assisted psychotherapy. And my practice is also now doing a psilocybin assisted psychotherapy study. So I'm also doing that kind of work with patients. So that's where I am at in my psychedelic assisted psychotherapy journey and where I'm at in all of that. So Judaism, psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, that's me.
Awesome. Those are some beautiful correlations coming together. So our next speaker is Natalie Ginsberg, and then after Natalie, Sammy. So just go ahead and introduce yourselves, and please share with us everything wonderful that you're about, and also about your Judaism if you feel inclined. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me and for facilitating this conversation. Everything about me that's hard. I'll try to focus on the psychedelic Jewish elements for now. I think I've been working at MAPS for 8 years. Today is actually my 8-year anniversary. Exactly. Thank you. So yeah, I've had a few different roles at MAPS. I founded the policy team and worked as director of policy and advocacy for most of my time. And then took actually a sabbatical after 7 years. And now I work as the global impact officer. But yeah, I also co-founded the Jewish Psychedelic Summit during the pandemic, which maybe we'll get more into later. But my psychedelic journey definitely has been a really beautiful complement with my Jewish journey and vice versa. I grew up in New York City. I live in LA now. But growing up, I was also raised conservative Jewish and always very much connected with Judaism. But yeah, my experience with kind of my psychedelic process really there are a number of things, but one of the things was kind of engaging with different indigenous practices and cultures around, mystical experiences. And I found myself in an ayahuasca ceremonies, singing Hebrew prayers that I had learned growing up and kind of wondering how that could be a helpful framework, and finding that, in fact, for me was a really deepening framework to be able to sing the songs my ancestors have been singing and kind of connect in ways that worked with my lineage. And yeah, there's a lot more there, but I'm definitely deeply excited by this conversation. And there's a lot of reasons. I think there's a lot of benefit to us exploring this intersection. There are a lot of Jewish psychonauts out there, a lot of Jews with thousands of years of trauma. And I think the more that we can kind of explore, the better. But sorry, I guess I'm getting off about me. I guess I'll just briefly, I'm also trained as a social worker. So I came to this work really interested in better ways of working with trauma that were kind of addressing the root sources rather than just the symptoms. And I also saw that policy and systemic issues were such a big source of trauma often. Certainly in the case of Jewish people, so much of our trauma stems from like horrific political, decisions or discrimination and trauma on kind of cultural levels. So psychedelic work and drug policy reform in general really kind of resonated with that for me. And I've been, really lucky to get to explore that and meet so many incredible folks doing this work and a lot of Jewish folks doing this work, which has been really a beautiful process to hear, where people are across the spectrum with their connection with Judaism and psychedelics and how that played different roles, helping make some people become more religious, some people become more disconnected who were maybe really religious before. Just a really beautiful, interesting process. But maybe I'll stop for now.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Very touched by your words that you shared there. Sammy, why don't you go ahead and round us off, and then we'll start in with some questions.
Oh, sure. I'm sorry. I'm like fangirling a little bit right now with all of you guys. I'm Sammy Witness. I am a grad student. I'm studying couples and family therapy and also on the path to becoming a sex therapist. I'm currently a sex educator. I predominantly work with families, helping them to speak to their kids about sex and all things gender and so on and so forth. And I also have like a strong focus on like child grooming awareness and prevention processes. So that's sort of my background. I am Jewish through and through, although not conservative upbringing. In fact, I'm probably what you might call a Hebrew school dropout. And I am on the path that I'm on with therapy and sex therapy because my partner is a stage 4 cancer patient. And that is what brought me back to school and also put both of us on a path towards our interest in psychedelics and therapy. So I'm very interested in seeing how I can incorporate this type of therapy in the future. I want to work with cancer and chronic illness patients specifically. So it's very cool to meet you, Susanna, as well. And as well as working with sexual assault victims with this therapy. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. So I want to talk about a little bit about assimilation. I think Natalie spoke for a minute about the fact that there's like this Jewish culture, there's kind of this psychonaut, Jewish renegade history, I think in a lot of our popular culture of psychedelics. But how do we acknowledge or hold space for the fact that, assimilation is kind of the name of the game? And a lot of groups, whether they're indigenous or what have you, talk a lot about what it feels like to be in cultures that require a lot of us in terms of assimilation, in terms of giving up pieces of ourselves. And I think for the Jewish experience in the United States, a lot of it historically, if we're just speaking about the United States, has been about a loss of culture in some ways, and assimilation and the impact of colonization, if you will, kind of a broader perspective of colonization. And when we look at Christian modalities or ideas or ideologies, they're so interwoven into the American landscape, into the American culture, that as Jews have become more becoming part of the assimilation, the greater assimilation of the culture, I think it's hard sometimes to figure out as this psychonaut going into these new areas that aren't necessarily new, right? Wolfie, stop that, please. That aren't necessarily new, they're old, perhaps, in so many ways. We're learning now that these medicines were part of the Jewish experience, from the beginning, and in so many ways that for me has felt difficult sometimes when I bring this to certain people's attention within my community who say, we're not interested in your drug talk. And I'm like, well, actually, you're interested in history and you're interested in Jewish culture and you're Jewish and, maybe you would want to know some of this information. But that's my own stuff. That's where I get stuck. I get triggered because I feel like people are in the Jewish community aren't moving forward quickly enough, or they aren't embracing the impact that this could have for the community, quickly enough, or seeing how this is anti-racist drug work. And this is, why Jews were in the South getting lynched along with the Blacks. This is all interrelated, and I get very worked up about it. That's not helpful. I'm now trying to find more productive ways of having these conversations. But I'm wondering, as we talk about assimilation, what does it mean to, like for me, I joined the ayahuasca church. It was based on a Christian model. I thought about when Natalie was talking about singing Hebrew songs, I thought about, even though Jonathan Goldman led that organization and was, raised Jewish, how much I wanted there to be a Jewish version of the Santo Daime, right? It's like, I liked the order. I liked the order. And maybe some of that came from the Catholicism, but I liked the order. But I realized that I wanted to have a Jewish experience, and I wanted to hear a cantor, and I would go to synagogue, and I would want the cantor that was singing at synagogue, these beautiful, beautiful, just tonal songs. I wanted that to be in my ayahuasca experience. So you can't like create these things sometimes, but I felt like I just had to squeeze myself into the Christian model. And when I complained about it, my friends in the ayahuasca community said, "Are you kidding me? I'm not Christian. I'm, Buddhist." I mean, I just replace, when they say Jesus, I replace it with Buddha in my mind, or, in my thoughts. And I go, okay. So how do we counter the assimilation? And maybe that, you just apply it to your general experience of being Jewish in the culture. But the psychedelic revolution for me can feel like a wave. It feels like a tsunami. So why don't we start off with Natalie responding, and then we'll go back to the original. Just ignore me. We'll go back to the original pattern of speaking. Thank you.
And thank you for definitely all those deep thoughts, and there's a lot to get into with that. But I think your question about assimilation, it's also a lot there. I think what kind of comes to me first, I think is important to acknowledge in this conversation, understanding like the history of criminalization and like persecution of witches, actually, and how often early witches were Ashkenazi Jewish women, well, at least the witches in Europe during that time, and they're practicing different like Jewish rituals and traditions and things that did have to, like, literally out of safety. Like Jewish assimilation, as with many cultures, is actually a matter of safety often, and after that time, like what did Judaism have to push underground, especially what women-led rituals and having women empowered and lighting candles and doing things like that. So I think that's kind of where I even start thinking about assimilation and that way. And I was reading Dara Horn's book, People Love Dead Jews, which I recommend, is really powerful, interesting. Not as it is depressing, but not quite as what it sounds. But she also explained this story around assimilation I didn't know of. I had always heard at Ellis Island, people had to change their names to make them more like, the people doing immigration couldn't understand the names, and so they made it Americanized. But Dara Horn gets into it. She said that's BS. They had all people speaking Yiddish and everyone working there. And actually, there's tons of court cases where new Jewish immigrants were applying to have their name changed and saying they can't get jobs. Their kids are being made fun of. So it was really sad. Like on the one hand, to be like, it was coming from the, I was like, what? Like Jewish people did that, and then saying, wait, I have to understand how impossible it was to make it in a new country, and all of these, the levels that assimilation is. About response to prejudice and all of that. And yeah, I think similarly, you bring up UDV, I think you're referencing, and it's funny because I just spoke to a Jewish leader in the UDV yesterday and asked literally, like, I'm curious, how do you reconcile being Jewish with this? And like he had shared that he felt that UDV fundamentally, because it believes in reincarnation, which is a fundamental difference in Christianity with this like hell idea. So for him, that was a really big shift, that he felt it really wasn't Christianity, that it has elements of all different religions. So that was how he explained it. I'm certain, you know, for me, that doesn't feel like a good fit personally, but it is worth exploring maybe later why there are a lot of Jewish leaders involved in that, or people who at least were born Jewish or had Jewish ancestry. But I think a lot of Jewish people I connect with in this space actually lacked that kind of spiritual practice in their Judaism, not of course because it doesn't exist in Judaism, but maybe the communities and ways that people have had access have cut that off. And maybe in service of your question about assimilation, that was like part of it, like how to make synagogues look more like churches and have more similar rituals and traditions, and rather than like all our different holidays all the time doing crazy things. But I've definitely seen a resurgence of young folks like engaging with a lot of the different Jewish traditions and really like being proud and honoring the different things, that almost like making memes like, look how cool this Jewish holiday is now. And that's been a really beautiful thing to see. That I think assimilation, of course, in some ways it's still necessary for survival and is still happening. But in other ways, I've seen like a young Jewish folks in the US be kind of identifying and connecting in different ways. And I know the older Jewish establishment is always like, Jews are disappearing and no one's joining our JCCs and UJs. I'm like, okay, well, look at Jewish TikTok. That's like popping off right now. So how are we like connecting these things? And, I do think Jewish psychedelic conversations might be a really helpful way to start making those connections. So yeah, but I'll end that for now.
Well, I think exactly the way I hold space in all psychotherapy my whole career was, I'm going to hold space for the patient with however they're connecting to their spirituality or their religion. I worked for a Catholic nonprofit for a decade. And most of my patients were Catholic. I worked with nuns as they were grieving at the end of their lives. They hold space in their way. I'll hold space in my way. They'd say, you're a good Catholic girl, right? And I'd say, I'll hold space for you. And, I wouldn't answer them or, whatever. And some of my favorite patients were, some of those nuns who were some of the most progressive, 100-year-old women I'd ever met. But now in my work, I like seeing that same way of how we can open up ourselves to new possibilities, new ways of healing and repairing. For me, always Judaism has come through in my work through that embodiment of tikkun olam, that way of repairing, striving to repair our world, ourselves. And that's always how psychotherapy has been for me. And that, bringing psychedelic therapy in that same way, bringing in the ritual aspects of Judaism, singing nigunim or lighting candles or chanting Havdalah in a circle under the stars. That's my Judaism for me. It's about ritual. It's not about reading the Torah necessarily or digging into the Talmud. For me, it's always been about ritual. That's the stuff that gets me, kind of camp Judaism is really the stuff that I'm like, oh yeah, that's what I love. So when you get into that psychedelic psychotherapy where there's lots of ritual and that can really make it meaningful, and being in a circle feels really magical and lighting a candle feels really magical, and sometimes there's scents that come into it, and all of your sensory aspects that get intertwined. That's like the apex of the work for me, is like, oh, everything's coming together. It's Judaism and it's spirituality and it's the psychotherapy. It's like nirvana for me as far as, bringing me and my work together. And I love it. And probably 90% of the patients doing the work with me now, even just in ketamine work, are having really spiritual experiences. Many of my patients are talking to God and having really, really profound experiences. And it's just really powerful stuff. And it gets me excited. Every day at work is exciting. And I can't say that about every day of just talk therapy. it's exciting to help people for sure, but it's really exciting work doing the psychedelic work. I'll pass it on to Sammy.
Thank you. I'm trying to gather my own thoughts here. I love that you brought up the ayahuasca, because I had a very similar thought when it came to the Church of Daime. My partner had joined it and did do a ceremony with them and discussed all the hymns and how they really had to try to make it their own experience. And I think, yeah, that's kind of just in some situations up to us. And also when I think about ayahuasca, I think I personally want to respect the origins of those ceremonies. But when it comes to psychedelics, and I think of a simulation, I think of it really similarly to the way that I think about normalizing the topics that I would teach in sex education. And what I mean by that is the more that we can share, and the more that we can share about the connections between psychedelics and Judaism, the more it becomes so this is just the way that it is, if that makes sense. And I think there's just a lot of potential to make every experience your own, as far as your personal connection to Judaism and psychedelics, as well as your community's connection to it. I don't know.
Yeah.
I feel very green in this conversation, so I'm just
you're hitting on some really interesting points around
I go back to probably the burning bush was ayahuasca. If we really want to get into the indigenous piece of it, all of the tribes all of the way back were probably using these drugs. So,
or some kind of drug. I think there was a theory that it wasn't ayahuasca, but something similar. That was, I forget the kind of bush.
I can share some of the different theories around that for sure.
Please.
There's definitely a few different ideas, and yeah, I think with the point that you're hitting on of honoring the indigenous, the origins of different traditions, with ayahuasca in particular, something really important to consider. I want to name that Daime UDV is not the origin of ayahuasca. It's kind of colonization and other folks coming in. So that feels different, but I do agree. And it does have, it has a history of over 100 years of practice. So I don't mean to also discount that, but it's a bit unique in that. But I think there's a huge thing. There are tons of ayahuasca circles around Israel, and the ones I have attended that do use Hebrew. What is that is that not respecting and honoring other traditions? And I think is it cultural appropriation? Or there's a lot of deep questions there. So I think that's kind of what I heard you asking around, and I think it's definitely something that is not an easy answer. And one of the reasons I did feel called to explore more of the plants from the region, because there are different plant combinations that are similar to ayahuasca that you can use from the region. There's, in acacia, it actually contains DMT, and there's Assyrian rue as MAO inhibitor. There are a few different plants around that have been used in some traditions. We haven't found yet proof that combination was used in the Levant area, but there's actually some indigenous communities in Iran that have used similar traditions like that. But in Sinai, I have been really blessed to get to kind of climb Mount Sinai and meet with different local Bedouin healers, medicine folks around, and kind of try to understand that. I was where's the burning bush? And they have different theories around that. And the bush that this healer said he thinks it wasn't a psychedelic bush, but that he ate something else psychedelic and saw this bush on fire. I don't know, but they're all different things. There's an apple that around Sinai that people say can make you kind of see visions. And there's the one thing that actually really most got my attention was datura, which actually exists around the world. It's a flower that can grow in a bush and on a tree. There are kind of a few. It grows in LA, but it was growing near Mount Sinai, and it's very powerful. It's can have quite deep impacts. It's not even fully psychedelic. There's another word that's escaping me right now, but we experience some pretty dramatic like visions and distortions. So I think that's interesting. But to kind of backtrack for a second there, in the Torah itself, there's mentions of cannabinosim, and what there are even more mentions of is burning of incense of Ketoret, which was a very special mixture of sacred incense that was be burned like in certain rooms only for the high priest to get. It's like a hot box. They were like had an enclosed space burning these substances that, to me, it seems pretty obvious there's some psychoactive component to that. And some of the language in the Torah, it's like, they were like connecting with God. Or there's one tradition in the temple on Yom Kippur, a priest would go into this room filled with coals and would be in there for a day, and they would tie a rope to his foot in case they needed to pull him out. So like clearly like something was happening, and that was definitely a tradition back then. Yeah, and then the cannabis was used as oil. But, it's interesting. I will say that there's still some people who are a little resistant. They're like, we don't know that cannabinosim is cannabis. Like, it's translated as a fragrant blossom. But then 2 years ago, they actually found in Tel Arad, which is a site outside Jerusalem, they found cannabis in a ritual altar that said Yahweh, which is Hebrew for God, underneath, and from 800 BC. So we don't, maybe cannabinosim doesn't mean cannabis, but Jews were also burning cannabis at a ritual altar that said Yahweh on it. So, there's some people who still want to be haters, but I think it's pretty clear that at least there was something involved in the practice. And I think there's a lot in the indigenous question with Judaism, how it's a very land-based tradition. All of our holidays are really aligned with the lands and the seasons of Israel, like where current day Israel is. So I think it does kind of open some really interesting questions of different plants. There, I'll just say one more thing because it clearly is a passion of mine. But there are certain plants like etrog. The etrog actually has trace amounts of DMT in it. So it's really interesting to like wonder why the etrog is this really special plant on Sukkot. For folks who don't know, there's like a holiday where that's like one of this holy plants to honor. And yeah, so there's just like a lot of kind of stuff to keep exploring, I think.
Etrog was the one that I was thinking of for the burning bush that I had read, was like the big theory.
So the next question for y'all, and we can start with Natalie and kind of go in that new sequence. So Natalie, you're back on. No pressure. The next question, and my questions tend to be kind of meandering, like thoughts more than questions, but as we look at the synagogue experience as it's typically kind of understood in our modern day, as Natalie was talking about, kind of more assimilated church-like synagogues or what have you, whatever we have now, right, in terms of what Judaism looked like, 500 years ago versus now, at least in this country versus other countries. What we see now is maybe we see, different experiences. When I go with my friends to an Orthodox synagogue, I'm having a very different experience than what my friend Jeremy calls the Reform Christians, So there's a wide context for what it might look like to be practicing, right, in a traditional sense. But yet when I'm going to synagogue, sometimes I'm left with a sense of like, yeah, this would be really cool if we could combine this, right, in some way. I want to do all this healing. I want to do all this talking. I want to do all this kind of rote memorization that feels futile at times, right? I kind of like it. I like the redundancy of it. I really like the cantors, there's certain aspects of going to service that really means something to me, even if there are some watered down aspects that are reflective of assimilation. So that having been said, when I leave that experience and I'm going, man, I don't want to go over here and have my psychedelic experience and feel taboo about it or feel hush hush about it or feel like I can only talk to my therapist about it or whatever. I want it somehow integrated into my religious community, right? How do I make that happen? Or is this the wave of the future? Are we going to see rabbis doing psychedelic services more and more? Are we going to see psychedelic synagogues? Are we going to see psychedelic Passovers? Like, you know, is it just going to get bigger and wilder and crazier and more beautiful, because you're going to see what Natalie was talking about, which is maybe this falling in love with Judaism, or falling in love with the culture, or falling in love with how do I find community here, in those traditional ways. So what my question is, you know, where are psychedelics going to lead us? Are they going to make Judaism more alive for lots of people, where maybe Judaism was stuck on some shelf and they pull it out once a year for like high holidays? So Natalie, take it away.
Well, say Baruch Hashem. I hope it will continue to do that. And I think, yeah, there's so many kinds of synagogue experiences living in the US. I mean, living in this time in the US, we probably have by far the most access to different types of Jewish practice that any Jews have ever had in history. Certainly have to be the most women rabbis around. It's like amazing looking in LA. I'm like, oh, well, there's this woman rabbi who's really cool, and I like this part of her service. And I'm very lucky in LA. I know that's not the norm everywhere, but there really are a lot of incredible congregations that are experimenting and doing different things. And you know, I don't want to throw out all the reform of saying like what, you know, I hear what you said, that some reform can be a bit like, you know, English and no music, and kind of miss some of that heart. But I've been attending some more kind of Jewish renewal inspired services, which are very psychedelic. All the leaders are major psychedelic people, and they, you know, have reform elements, but also have the elements of like singing and ritual and like that kind of spiritual connection part. So I definitely hope, like, I've seen my friends themselves get more interested in going to different kinds of services, you know, when maybe they would just go with their parents, and now they're like, yeah, I wonder what like a cool younger service would look like. And but I think there's also a place, as you said, for like more, you know, traditional things. I think it can get tricky sometimes when, like, you know, we're like organizing joint medicine spaces with like Haredi men who don't want to be with women in a space, or things like there's certain like boundaries that I think are important to like be thinking about. But I think that, you know, we already are having a bunch of pretty prominent rabbis are speaking, you know, at the summit. It was really exciting. We had a number of rabbis speak publicly for the first time. And since then there's been, you know, like again in LA, there a pretty prominent rabbi here, like had to talk about psychedelics and grief at his synagogue. So I think rabbis who are smart are learning about it and wanting to support their congregation through these things, and knowing young people are interested, but also older folks and people, you know, there's just a lot there. And I think, you know, speaking to Susanna was mentioning how many of her patients have spiritual experiences. And actually most people who access ketamine don't have therapists, don't have any like support, or, hey, you might see God. They're just like, oh, all right, come back next week. Like, just don't get too dizzy in the next 20 minutes. So first of all, that's really scary to me. But then where I'm really interested is, like, you know, for every person to have access to people that are culturally aware and understand the spiritual framework they might be interested in exploring. And I have had Jewish friends and folks who have had not Jewish therapists who maybe haven't had a spiritual framework that fully fits, or, you know, so I think it's something to consider for people exploring psychedelic therapy. Is that something that feels important to you, to have a therapist and a space that can hold, you know, if you're having a vision that has, like, you know, I've had visions of like the tabernacle or things that I like literally was like, what is this? And because of like certain reading I was doing, I was like, okay, that kind of makes sense. And I'm very grateful for like that space. But I think the synagogue is really important. I think, you know, the core teaching of Judaism, or like practice, is the minyan, is having 10 men, but, you know, say like in practice it's 10 families is what it's saying. So I really love that concept of like being in community. Being Jewish is a community practice. It's not like, you know, it's really tries to create that. So I see the synagogue as that. It's like, this is how do we like hold together as a community and come together and heal and connect. And yeah, so I think, I guess to end that, I think I've also seen a lot of cool things coming out of the synagogue, like wilderness Torah, like people have Passover in the desert, or, you Shabbat is becoming like people are reconnecting so much with, self-care and taking time off cell phones. I feel like it's almost a trendy thing, and there are all these Shabbats, people wear white, and a lot of my non-Jewish friends are like attending them now. Like, I feel like there's more touch points for people to have like deeply spiritual, meaningful, ritualistic experiences that aren't necessarily in synagogue, but I think it also opens people up to like going to more Jewish experiences. And also just say, for the people who are pushing back on you, like, there's so much research with like prominent Jewish like, therapists, and the Israeli government is like sponsoring our stuff. Like, I feel like I actually have been happy to see there's been a lot less resistance in my bubbles. And granted, I work at MAPS and live in LA and New York, but like, there, especially in the Jewish world, with building the summit, we expected some pushback, and we got pretty mainstream funding, and like people seem to be like, and I'll end with that. Something I'm very grateful about in Judaism is our core teaching of questioning everything and holding space. And for the few people who said, the cannabis is not in the Torah, they're like, but that's an interesting theory, and where do you see it? And like, they kind of invited in the conversation, and definitely weren't like, get out of here, it's blasphemy. And I see in other religions, there's not as much space for that. And even Christianity does not have space for that. And a lot of Christian leaders actually said it helped to have all these prominent rabbis talking about psychedelics, because then they could go like, see, like, so it's okay to start that conversation. So I've been very proud and grateful like for that space.
Yeah, for me, I think that's where we start, because Judaism is about questioning things. At least for me, that's what it was always about growing up. And that was something I always loved, I guess, a little bit flaunting in front of my very conservative friends. And growing up in Spokane we're all about questioning things in my religion. And yeah, I think that because Jews love science, we love to learn about how things work. We love to understand, how the brain works and how nature works and how the universe works. That's what psychedelics are all about. It's how do we understand how we work and how we work in the universe and within nature. I mean, all of the ways that you can then see your place in all of that with psychedelics is so exciting. I think that's the opportunity with all of this. And I can see so well how you could start with Havdalah, that beautiful ceremony, that beautiful ritual. Like, you start small, you start with something small, and there's so many opportunities for beautiful ritual and beautiful connection. And I'm excited to see where things go. But I keep pushing. I think it's happening. I think it's coming.
Thank you. Sammy, you want to go ahead?
Sure. Well, Suzanne, not only do Jews love science, but we love activism. So there's that too. Seattle is slim picking for synagogues. Nonetheless, synagogues hosting psychedelic services. But I will say that when I lived in New York City and also in South Florida, there were some synagogues there that if they were legally able to do those types of services, I'm sure they would be among some of the first. Definitely like some pretty progressive, like fun, different options. But going kind of back to the assimilation question and like tying that in, I think there's a lot of potential for communities, kind of like Natalie spoke to earlier, like younger Jewish people are connecting through different types of platforms and having events, with the potential to like host services like this outside of synagogues. For example, I will be at Burning Man in 2 weeks, and well, maybe not there, but just to connect with people who have similar interests. Like I know MAPS is a part of Burning Man. They have camps there. They have the Zendo project.
Are you talking about the Shabbat? I was picturing it before you even brought it up, and I was like,
yeah,
oh, on the same wavelength. But maybe you don't know that Burning Man has a massive Shabbat dinner.
I do, yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's what you're talking about, yeah.
I mean, there's entire Jewish camps there, and I don't know if I have this Jew radar, but I just managed to connect with a lot of Jewish people at Burning Man. But I think, I don't know, there's a lot of potential to connect with like-minded people who'd be interested in having kind of outside of the synagogue services like this. And then also through things like Natalie was saying, like Jewish TikTok. There's like great pages like Hey Alma, who I've connected with people on as well that talk. I think they even did a post or two about psychedelics and Judaism. But anyways, just there's a lot of potential for things outside of synagogue. That's my 2 cents.
So
I think there's a little bit of erasure in Seattle when it comes to stuff like this, but
well, Sammy,
yeah, go ahead.
I don't think we're hosting any psychedelic Shabbat yet, but I will say that I belong to Kol Hanishama, and they let me advertise this event there.
Wow. So. Wow. No, that's
and,
good.
Portland just had a psychedelic Jewish event. It's not that far away,
Right. Right. Well, it's interesting because I see myself like in my Jewish journey, like also like, as I'm journeying towards ayahuasca, when I flash back to doing the ayahuasca ceremony, the first time I did it was with a rabbi in a synagogue in Ashland, Oregon. And he did it once a year with the Santo Daime. So Jonathan Goldman, who was raised Jewish and doesn't identify as Jewish, he's the head of like basically a Christian church, but here's Jonathan Goldman with the rabbi drinking ayahuasca. So that was like my first experience. So it's like already I was like craving some way to connect with plant medicine, but also just found myself randomly in a synagogue drinking for the first time. And that felt so natural and so good for me. And so I think there's a part of me that's still craving, like, I want a psychedelic synagogue here in Seattle. I don't have time to start one, but we just got this office space. So if anyone else wants to start one and I can attend it, that would be great. Okay. So how about our last question for the evening? Where are women in all this? So when Natalie was talking about the witches, I'm all about the witches. I run the podcast, Strong Women in Psychedelic Politics. I'm all about how do we unearth the voice of the lost feminine? How do we define women as more than their physical, looks in this society that's so obsessed with youth? Like, how do we, honor the crone and the witch and not burn them, But I think it's interesting that we have been taught, I think, this story culturally about witches being burned and haven't made that connection to, we are talking about not just witches, we're talking about Jewish women. You know what I mean? We're talking about Jewish, maybe magical women. And so for those of us who feel magical, and Mira, sounds like you're feeling magical.
Well, I was Orthodox and I'm not now, and I am a psychotherapist, and I am in a process of journeying, and I have a whole thing that I'm doing personally. And one of the things that made me sure that I wasn't Orthodox was sitting and listening to the story about how these witches were all killed by these rabbis. These Jewish witches were killed. That story in the Talmud that talks about how when they lifted the women off the ground, when these students of this particular rabbi lifted the women off the ground, they lost their power. So they were these grounded women who could do their witchcraft, all of their embodied work because of their grounding. And they were Jewish witches, and they were killed by rabbis. And it did happen in our tradition. This is a very, very real thing. And in that moment of hearing this in my Orthodox synagogue, I felt this strong awareness that these were that I was that woman, and I was one of those women, and I come from those women, and that we all doing this come from that tradition. That is very much the tradition that we come from. We come from an actual experience of having that knowledge, and having that knowledge be so threatening that the women who hold it have to be killed. And I just want to say that is not a Christian story. That is a Jewish story. So I come to understanding of myself as a witch because I feel myself deeply to be a Jewish witch from that story. And that is really the final straw that pushed me out of orthodoxy into something else. So I don't mean to traumatize anybody, but I do need people to know that this is not a story that we have to borrow, that the story of our own rebirth gets to be here from our tradition.
Amen. Thank you for sharing that. And I don't even know that story from the Talmud and can't wait to dive into that. And, you know, what comes up for me, but of course I need to learn more, is like even those rabbis were living in, you know, Christian supremacist place where that was dangerous to have people in their community talking to the devil or what, you know, however that was seen. So I wonder how much of Jewish culture, even that did shut that down, was still like an assimilationist protective move. Because something like that really clicked for me, and actually this learning, and is why I also am sure it's also connected to Christianity, is because the caricature of what a witch looks like in Western culture of an ugly woman is literally an Ashkenazi woman, like based on the like hook nose, chin, dark, like all the features. I then later learned that vampires are also based on Jewish men, like hoarding money and blood-sucking Christian children, and the hook nose and the ears. So I think there really was also some elements like culturally how that played, and never mind the resounding trauma for generations of understanding that, like what that means for, you know, how we feel about ourselves and understand ourselves. And yeah, so there's a lot of levels there. But I also feel like, as you're saying, in this time, there's this amazing space for women to re-engage and do some deep healing. Actually, I feel like there's like a time of like reckoning with patriarchy in Judaism, and so I'm really excited to see so many strong Jewish like women stepping forward to re-engage and continue building. I mean, because Judaism has this questioning, and it really asks us to keep re-engaging with it. That's how I interpret it, and I'm super. It's so important. And, you know, moving into this more ritualistic, embodied spiritual way of being, that often is a really women-led way. And like Judaism has become so in the head, masculine, studied, like in this way, which has, I think, been a trauma survival mechanism, which makes sense because it hurts a lot to be in our body when all this shit's happening for thousands of years, you know, but understanding what that healing process is like, integrating, coming back to our body, healing the masculine, feminine, you know. I think there's a lot there. I mean, I guess it's worth mentioning Asherah in this question, who, and there's some traditions where she was like the wife of Yahweh, of the Jewish God. And, you know, we were always taught there's one God, and that's so strict. And an understanding that there are Jewish traditions with the wife of God, and Asherah was a goddess that in the region in Mesopotamia, and there are like a lot of Judean houses that were like Jewish practicing and had Asherah statues. And then, you know, the Torah like calls for like wiping out all of that. And so there's this, from my understanding, a point when Judaism kind of became a temple, like all like surrounded the temple, they were kind of clearing out the women leaders and honoring that. And so there was something in that I feel called to like understanding what happened, and maybe there's some healing to do of elevating these like Jewish mystical leaders, and honoring that there is something, you know, I personally do have, you know, issues with the idea of like the lineage only being passed through a mother, and certainly have, like, I believe people are Jewish if they, you know, that's not the only way to be Jewish. But I think it's also something to consider how that honors the woman in Jewish culture. And like, you know, how my mom always explained it to me was like how much, you know, if you're lucky to be living, you know, with your mother, that how much culture is really taught, like Judaism really relies on the mother for like passing those rituals, traditions, the food, the gathering. Like there's a lot of those elements where I really see that Judaism like puts it on the woman that way. So yeah, I'll stop for now.
Well, I mean, I think our Jewish community knows oppression well, but we also need to always really attune to all of the marginalized communities that have paid such heavy prices for the fear of white men. But, you know, the discourse around psychedelics has historically been largely dominated by men, but I really am excited because there's so many female scholars and artists and therapists that are now really leading the research and educational aspects of the field today. So it gets me really excited. I'm excited to meet Natalie today. I'm excited to meet Sammy
nice to
today.
meet
Excited to meet Mira today. And I think that, the inherent feminist nature of psychedelic experiences will continue to elevate all of this for hopefully all of our communities. And we will continue to hopefully spread the positive energy forward in our community here in Seattle.
Amen. I have just a quick thing to add, like that reminded me that, when you're saying it has mostly been men, it's something that honestly, there's been a lot of Jewish men actually, and there actually been a lot of Jewish women that just didn't get all the recognition and were maybe spending
in the background.
In the background or the partner, but like they're
partners
actually
of a lot of the
from the
researchers.
beginning of they're like really interesting in the 60s, one of like the first women to like experience there's just a lot of very interesting stories about actually Jewish women in particular I've found when I start digging. So hopefully
me too.
Can also help like elevate, right? Isn't that fun? I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Who's this person?
It's like, oh, look, and she was a PhD too, but she's not credited in a lot of the research.
My mother tripped a lot when I was small. So I come from that tradition, and I actually met somebody who my mother was good friends with, and a thing that they did, and I don't know how I actually feel about this. I will just admit it, that they nursed, my mother and her had babies around the same age. And so they would, if they would trip, and then the other, either me or her daughter, would nurse from only the non-tripping mother. And then
a wet nurse.
Switch. It was so I found out this woman had nursed me. This woman who lives in Israel had nursed me. So that is a really interesting story. I found out much later in my life that was something that they did. I didn't even know. My mom passed, and I didn't even know this about my mom. And I now have this information because this woman told me.
Are there any questions from anyone to anyone else, either a panel member or someone in the audience, or Mira, or anyone in our last minutes together? I feel very blessed to have been here. There was just certain things that were shared that, I think I only could hear from women, for women, by women, things that really stood out to me in terms of, I didn't think I would be as emotionally moved, Mira, as when you started talking. And when Natalie was speaking about similar things of women's stories and how women have been treated, and especially witchy women, and just the power of all that. And so I thought what you shared was so beautiful in terms of reclaiming that. So I think it takes away a lot of the stigma, because I didn't grow up with my mom comfortably using the word witch. Do you know what I mean? She might use the word feminist. She might use a lot of other words, and she was in a male dominated occupation. And I saw her have a lot of the toughness that Natalie talked about, that Jews have had to really be in survival mode. And so they've really honed those masculine characteristics and being in the head and not being in the body. And I saw my mom be very masculine in order to survive in her occupation. And I don't want to be that. And I want to look at how do we let women be witches again, or honor the witches that are still here, and kind of honor those lineages, because I think those lineages are very special. And we talk about Jewish lineage, but I think there's also something separate when we talk about witch lineage. And I think it's very special when we reclaim the witch. It feels like a great moment of healing in this world. So in terms of repairing a world that is torn, I feel like the witches are going to help us sew that wound closed. So I'm very moved, and I just want to say thank you to all of you. I don't really have anything else to add other than thank you. But I would like anyone else to just jump in here before we say goodbye tonight, and, just grateful for each other.
Thank you for convening us. There's some I'm really so happy to be connected with you all and have this beautiful conversation. Also, want to honor that it is the full moon today, so it feels extra witchy in this witchy conversation. I feel like that probably came through. It was like during our talk was actually the peak full moon was in like 30 minutes ago. So there you go.
Thank you, ladies.
Thank you so much. Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
me. It was great to meet you.
Great to meet you all. Bye.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mira. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Mira. Yeah,
Yeah, thank you.
Oh,
Definitely.
Natalie, will I see you at Burning Man? Will you be there?
I will be there. Yeah, I will be there for sure. Where are you camped?
245 and G at Heartbeats.
Ah, so you're near all the like maps and camping
Mhm.
stuff. Nice.
Where are you at?
645 and C, Cosmic Camels. If you should definitely come by. I'll probably be hanging there most, like I'm having kind of a chiller burn this year. I just got my monkeypox vaccine today, so
I did too.
nice. You're the first other like woman I've met who has actually.
I was one of 2 women in like the longest line you could possibly imagine of predominantly gay men.
Yep, same.
Yep.
I bet San Francisco or LA, sorry. Okay, have a good night, you guys.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye,
Okay.
thank you.